Susanna Marsden, and welcome to Job Shadowing HE, the podcast that delves into the roles of people working in higher education. Each episode hears from guests about what's involved in their role, the career path that led to it, and tips on how to get in and get on in these jobs. My guest in this episode is Andrea Bolshaw, currently Interim Registrar and Secretary at the University of Brighton. Andrea started her higher education career as a graduate trainee and subsequently carved out a career path that took her to holding one of the most senior university positions of Registrar and Secretary. In 2023, Andrea took a major professional decision to leave permanent employment and move into the freelance world. Since that time, she's been Interim Registrar and Secretary at 2 institutions, and in this episode, she shares her experiences and personal reflections on life as an interim. Andrea, welcome to today's podcast, and thanks for being my guest on this episode. Let's start with your career background. You've worked in higher education for just over 25 years. And from what I've read up about you, you've carved up an interesting and varied career path across a number of roles and in different types of institutions. Can you tell us a bit more about that career path and how you've gone about joining it all together?
Thank you, Susanna. Well, I'm honoured to be here. So I started as a graduate trainee at Sheffield University Medical School, and that was really helpful because it was a roving role where I was tasked to problem solve aspects of administration and assessment that hadn't gone very well. So there are opportunities to get really stuck in, investigate, connect with staff and students. And I was then fortunate that they created an opportunity for me to apply for before the end of the 12-month traineeship. I really love Sheffield, and I've still got a huge soft spot for it now with many friends there that I established during that time. But there was a freeze on post. So after 3 years, I was ambitious and impatient, and I was told that I was unlikely to be successful for the next grade up because this would be the equivalent of a postdoc in the academic equivalent, and I wasn't old enough to have got to that stage. But I did get the next role, and that was at BCU, and this was a central university role in academic quality. I wasn't there for very long because a new role came up within a year at the University of Birmingham, which combined my BCU experience with my previous medical school experience. It was a new role. It was a quality assurance manager working across both the medical schools, education provision and the NHS. And then after a few years, I secured a new role there, leading the operations of all the medical schools' educational portfolio. And so after these 2 roles over 9 years, I knew at that point that I wanted to be a registrar and secretary. So I secured the role of academic registrar at Coventry University. And when I informed the University of Birmingham, the head of college came to see me and asked me what he could do to persuade me to stay. This was an amazing morale boost, but while the medical school at the time that I was there was 4 times the size of Aston University in its entirety, I knew what I needed was a central university leadership role that would put me on the trajectory to the registrar and secretary role that I ultimately wanted to secure. And so in my 8 years as the academic registrar at Coventry, it was a really invigorating role, dealing with lots of variety across the institution, dealing with lots of great people. And there was, a significant amount of systems work and people transformations, as well as some overseas work, again, which I relished.
And so after those 8 years as academic registrar at Coventry, you then had the opportunity to take the next step and go on to your first registrar and secretary position, the most senior professional services role in an institution that combines a wide range of executive responsibilities as well as governance responsibilities.
So when my youngest child was just over 1, I became the registrar and secretary at Birmingham Newman University, which is a small cathedrals group university. I knew I was relatively young compared to my peer group, so I needed to build my experience as a registrar and secretary and a university executive. So I was keen to add to my experience of universities a smaller institution with a faith-based dimension. And while at Newman, I gained some great experience. So I supported the search for 2 new vice-chancellors and the chair of a board, as well as leading the university during the cessation of activity during COVID and then the transition back. At the point of lockdown, the new VC had been in post just 3 weeks. So, some great experiences during that time in post. But overall, I hope that I've been able to demonstrate in my career that you can undertake an executive role as a parent, and I think particularly as a mother with young children and a full life, without having to reduce your career aspirations to work at a senior level. And hopefully people will see that in the sector and they know that all of that is possible.
And you've just given us some small insight there into some of the challenging experiences you had in what was just over 7 years as Registrar and Secretary at Newman. And as we'll hear in a few moments, you've gone on to undertake 2 more of those positions elsewhere. The Registrar and Secretary role is a unique and highly influential role within higher education executive teams. And you have dual accountability, one reporting line to the Vice-Chancellor and another reporting line to the governing body. How does that role work in practice, and how do you go about navigating those relationships?
It is tricky, and I think it's important that your role is fully understood because that also helps to engender trust. So establishing those relationships very early on and imparting your understanding of those interplays and how you can add value in your initial induction period is absolutely key. I think this often means having quite deep level conversations, actively listening and probing, because that not only helps you to gain an understanding, but it enables people to understand that your experience in the respective roles can help and support them because you're asking insightful questions. This aspect is, I guess, deliberately strategic and tactical, but it needs to focus on the golden triangle between the chair, the VC, and yourself as the secretary to the board, and the independence of that role to be an impartial servant of good governance in that particular side of the role above all else. I think these conversations also need to focus on the executive level responsibilities. I think in and around this, you also need to deal with day-to-day business, including curveballs, without too much difficulty. So ensuring people are cited on matters, but you have them in hand with the leadership that you've got within the teams that you manage. And this also engenders trust and confidence.
Across your career path, you've clearly built up significant skills and experience across that time. And you've been in permanent roles. You were in permanent roles until 2023. And then at that point, you made a major life decision and you left permanent employment to go into the freelance world. And since then, you were Interim Registrar and Secretary at Leeds Beckett University. And since April 2024, you've been Interim Registrar and Secretary at the University of Brighton. Now, the broad titles of those roles are the same as the roles that you had as your permanent Registrar and Secretary roles, but that interim word brings a whole new dimension. Can you tell us a bit more about what an interim does from the perspective of the institution?
Yeah, of course, and it is different. But I feel very fortunate that during the first 2 interims that I've done, it's been with 2 fantastic institutions, governing bodies, leaders and staff across the entire organisation. And I feel really privileged and honoured to have been interims in those institutions. The Vice-Chancellors, Peter Slee at Leeds Beckett and Deborah Humphreys at Brighton, and their executive teams have impeccable leadership behaviours and values. And this has enabled me to learn and grow in my own leadership capabilities. I think both of those institutions have very sound governing bodies with some excellent people on the board whose values are aligned to the institution and leadership. And all of that really, really helps. But ultimately, an interim executive brings their experience to provide stability to serve the governance and as part of the executive supporting the Vice-Chancellor and the interim's direct reports. I think it's a real opportunity to enable you to facilitate other people to thrive. And this includes showing an interest in providing support for their development, despite being an interim. I think actually that's really important, which feels counterintuitive because you're an interim, but I think it's key to enabling people to help them thrive. And I think it's a reflection period about how the new role works and providing that opportunity for the institution. I think as well, many introductory conversations that I've experienced in both of my interim roles can help people focus on the key issues that are in their minds and what really matters, and an element of reset, which is, I think, really helpful for all concerned.
You've just shared with us there some of the real benefits to the institution in having those interim periods of time. But I'm interested to know a bit more from your perspective about how the working life of an interim registrar and secretary differs from the working life of someone doing that role permanently.
Yeah, I think it's not for everybody, but it's incredibly energising. I think it's very full on, and at times your brain feels like it's going to explode. And now, having done 2 interims, those similar feelings came at the same periods. I think there are vast amounts of growth opportunities. But there is a great deal of personal discomfort. So, there's the travel, and therefore related to that, the diary management and the accommodation bookings and family logistics, and living a bit of a nomadic lifestyle, including, eating M&S meals for one, and travelling with a wheelie suitcase around everywhere. People who know me know that I wear high heel shoes, and people used to talk about hearing me coming with my high heel shoes. Now people can hear me coming with a wheelie suitcase. I think you've got to hit the ground running. So you've got that sinking or swimming in at the deep end, which means that, you can be chairing meetings feeling not fully appreciating of all the issues, not knowing what the terms of reference are specifically, not knowing everybody's names and roles, and not being familiar with the IT setup. Let's not forget about that. All the different systems are not necessarily working for you when you want them to. And when you're on campus, there's the getting about in an unfamiliar place. And there can be multiple campuses, and that can be quite tough when you're constantly on show as a senior leader and need to show that you're calm and capable of leadership. But I think there is, this is when authenticity comes in, and you have to be willing to make gaffes and not take yourself too seriously. And I think, again, that can really help with relationship building and people seeing that you're just human and normal.
Let's pick up on that point you just made there about relationships. Moving into any new role, and particularly at a senior level, means a lot of time needing to be spent on getting to know people and building relationships so that you can gain their trust. At the same time, as an interim, people know that you're in post for a relatively short period of time. They may have scepticism about what you're there to do, and they may actually just think you're not qualified because you're not there as a permanent post holder. How do you go about building those relationships and gaining that trust? And why is that important?
First, it is important to do your own due diligence before accepting that interim role, so that you feel there's an authentic two-way connection and aligned to the values between the VC and the chair and the members of this team. I think otherwise it will be difficult for you to add value and make an impact so rapidly. Clearly, there are difficult things to do in these roles, but I think it still comes back to authenticity. And if you're expected to behave in a way that compromises that, then it's probably not the right interim role for you to do. I think it's helpful that I've now worked at 7 different universities. And I guess I can speak the language and have sometimes often done the roles of the people in which I'm engaging in. And I think the connections that I have across lots of institutions, you can put colleagues in touch with like-minded colleagues to find out, what they're doing in a particular area. And I think it helps that I've done some of those things myself. So, right down from processing assessment results, doing student fitness to practice panels, right up to larger cross-cutting aspects such as managing transformations, chairing international validations, and launching and commissioning new systems. But I think what is absolutely key is prioritising and making those connections and establishing relationships, probably above everything else. Doing this can lead to some personal discomfort as the emails pile up. But you need to have as many one-to-ones and groups meetings as you can, because you will need to draw on those relationships probably quite quickly. There's an inevitability that things will happen in these roles, and you need to be able to work across teams to deal with that. And having established those relationships quite quickly, you'll be able to do that. And I think the conversations that you have will enable you to tune into organisational culture at pace. I think we're very fortunate in higher education that there are high levels of intelligence across the entire organisation, but this means that people can spot authenticity. So, it's absolutely key to be authentic and not make false promises. I think it's also important to remember with the teams that you lead that you work to serve them, not the other way around. The interim role is about stewardship and giving as much value as you can with your experience and positioning, because you've got no organisational baggage and you're able to make key behavioural and situational observations. And I think that's a real key point of having those fresh eyes. I think part of it is also to ensure that you enable teams to feel empowered and supported and developed during this interim period. It's a unique set of circumstances, I think, that really enables you to short circuit the initial phase of being new and rather than a permanent member of staff, but a special flavour of newness because you're an interim. And I think ultimately this helps, all of those things that I've talked about, helps to gain trust.
And you mentioned earlier about the function of an interim being there to fulfil a specific brief for that institution at a particular period of time. Again, comparing life as a permanent role holder with that of an interim, how do you go about making an impact in what's a relatively short period of time? And how can you show the impact you're making both to the institution as well as to yourself?
Yeah, I mean, that's an interesting question. I think you make an impact through your position as an interim and the agency that comes with that interim word and an interim approach. I think you can be emboldened by the very nature of being an interim. I think you can be more frank and people are actually fine with that. It's almost like there's a tacit understanding that you will bring this perspective, and it's often welcome because the institution has chosen to have an interim period. So you aren't embroiled in the politics, and while you're invested in the institution while you're there, and that is very important, you're able to have a clearer perspective. I think you're almost in the audience rather than being on the stage, and people want to hear the perspectives that you have. So I think the environment means by the very nature of your interim status, you can make an impact quite quickly. And because the nature of it is stewardship and empowering others and harnessing their expertise, you get quite quickly a sense that people are energised by this and their own approaches, and they feel liberated during this interim period often, I've found. But I think it also provides an opportunity of reflection for them to get a keener sense of what they might want for a permanent post holder. I think in terms of what I get from this, every university environment is a growth experience, and seeing those different cultures and operational structures and how they're working, combined with the contextual environmental factors, mean that you never stop learning. And so, it's really energising, and you really feel that you're making an impact, and therefore it's really rewarding.
Reflecting on what you've shared so far, the Interim Registrar and Secretary role is clearly holding a lot together. That's probably an understatement. You talked earlier about the working relationship with the VC and the chair of the board. You're then leading a significant number of people in your teams. You're holding the institution through a transition into a permanent setup. And then on top of that, you're having to familiarise yourself quickly with the people and the institution, taking your wheelie case around with you. And you talked a moment ago about needing to make an impact. And then on a more personal level, you've said about the travelling, you're not always near home because it depends on where that interim role is. And then in addition to all of that, you're still having to keep up with sector developments and your own professional development. So the interim role sounds like it requires a huge amount of energy and resilience. What's been your approach to this?
As I've said, I think it really helps you to grow significantly over a short period of time, and it builds confidence because it confirms the impact that you can make. So one thing that is absolutely important is about ensuring your well-being and continued development is a priority during this interim period. I think the expectations are rightly high, and therefore so are the rewards. But I think you need to guard against burnout, as you're almost always in a very intense period of heightened listening, understanding, being bombarded with new information on a practical and strategic level, and as well as an increase in general life juggling acrobatics. So nobody is going to give you that time and understanding yourself and giving you permission that this is an important part of the deal. I think an interim role is different because you're bringing a more intensive value. And so part of keeping yourself equipped to provide this is about incorporating well-being and development within that. I think you also need to be aware that when coming to the end of one interim, when you've done a great deal of hard work and you feel comfortable and settled in a way, it will be quite anxiety provoking to go into the next interim period and the anticipation of what you might face in terms of culture and behaviours. I think less so the operational challenge, because this is the norm. I think people know within the sector we're dealing with operational challenges as part of the day-to-day. And I think you can deal with anything if you have good people in that environment. I'm very, very fortunate in that I have one or two people in the sector who I can totally bare my soul with about any imposter fears that I feel in the lead up to a new interim role. And those listening to this know who they are, and I thank them for that. I think when I speak to these individuals and draw on them to talk through these anticipatory anxiety fears, we usually end up having a bit of a laugh at how ridiculous I've been a few weeks in when I've started my new interim role and everything's generally going okay. But I think you need to have those special individuals in your armoury. I don't think fear is a bad thing when going through that cycle of starting a new interim, because I think it keeps you grounded and on your toes, but it's something to be aware of.
When you took that leap from permanent employment to freelance in 2023, you'll no doubt have had some thoughts about what you thought it was going to be like. How do those thoughts compare with how you've actually found it to be? And is there anything that surprised you about your roles or about yourself during that time?
Yeah, I think I've been surprised by my ability to cope with a deluge of information, situations, people and logistics, many of which don't go to plan. And again, I talked about, making gaffes, but being comfortable about that, but still actually thriving. The other thing that I've been surprised with is, and I guess quite overwhelmed with, how positively people have responded to me. I also had not fully appreciated the experiences that I've had and gained over my career in higher education, and how helpful this is when having conversations about challenges and solutions. I also think at an executive level, it was incredibly useful for me to have undertaken my first executive role at a small institution. And I do think, and I know some of your other guests have talked about this, that this is hugely undervalued and underappreciated, not only in the sector, but also by executive search firms. I think those people working in institutions work broad and deep, and you have to be resourceful and creative. And it doesn't mean that you can't work at scale. You absolutely can, because I've proved that from the subsequent interim roles that I've undertaken. But actually, I think it equips you with the ability to be able to ask questions and probe, because you've got a greater level of understanding of what's going on under the bonnet than perhaps people who have always worked at scale.
Sharing what you have today about your career, Andrea, and life as an interim will certainly have given people a lot to reflect on. What would be your top 3 pieces of advice to someone contemplating moving from a permanent role into interim life?
I think first, it's about establishing relationships and making those meaningful connections, because that's a key foundation in being able to make an impact and then able to bring your experience to bear. I think everything else will settle in due course, as long as you've got those established relationships and meaningful connections. But the second thing is, as a result of that, you need to be prepared for some personal discomfort that you will feel. So it's important that you don't take yourself too seriously. And I think finally, prioritising your well-being and development, because they're very intensive assignments in the way that I've described. So I think that's what I would say as my 3 keys.
Andrea, it's been great talking with you today. Thank you so much for your time and for letting me shadow you.
Oh, it's an absolute pleasure. Thank you so much, Susanna.
Thank you for listening to Job Shadowing HE. The podcast was written and presented by Susanna Marsden, audio production and music by me, Rodri Marsden. More information about this podcast and previous episodes can be found at jobshadowinghe.com.